I remember the moment the phone call came in, clear as day, even though it feels like years ago now. My name is Noah Miller. I'm 34, a helicopter pilot with the Forest Service, and I've spent the last 10 years flying over wildfires and searching for survivors. When I'm not in the sky, I'm stuck on the ground, picking up pieces of a life that's always been one wrong move from falling apart. When I won the custody battle, the first thing I thought was, this is my chance. Max and Leo, my two sons, were only 12 and 6. Max had always been the older one, protective and sharp as a tack, even for his age. Leo, he wasn't as fast, but the kid had heart. But their mother, Lisa, couldn't give them what they needed anymore. Not after everything that had happened. So I fought for them. I fought for everything I could to make sure they'd have the future they deserved. The courtroom battle felt like it lasted 100 years. Lisa threw everything she could at me. The accusations, the pitying looks from the jury, the way she wept, like she was the one who'd been wrong. But I won. The judge ruled in my favor, granting me full custody. The weight of it hit me a lot harder than I expected. They were mine now, my responsibility. I thought I could handle it. I thought I could be the dad they needed. So what did I do? I packed them into the truck, said goodbye to Oregon, and drove them to my mom's house, a quiet place in the hills outside the city. I was about to leave for a wildfire deployment, but first, I needed to settle them. I could do this, I told myself. Mom had always been the go-to when I needed a place to crash, so I figured, why not her? The idea that she might be a little off had crossed my mind, but I ignored it. The boys would be safe there, I told myself. It wasn't long before I was waving goodbye to Max and Leo as I headed back to the airport, ready to fly off to some godforsaken fire in the middle of nowhere. I left them in my mom's care with a promise that I'd be back soon. My heart still felt heavy, but duty called. I couldn't leave a fire burning in the forest. I couldn't be there for my boys all the time. Not when I had a reputation to uphold. Not when I was fighting for promotion. So off I went. I never saw the truth about my mother's place until I was gone. I didn't know what I was leaving them to, not really. But as the days turned into weeks, Max would send me quick updates when he could. The tone in his texts began to change. First, it was simple things. Grandma's all right, and Leo's doing fine, just needs his meds. But then, it became harder to get any good news. Grandma forgot my lunch money again. Grandma's always sleeping. I'm taking care of Leo's meds. There were days when I didn't get a message at all. I tried not to read too much into it. Maybe he was busy, or maybe it was just too hard for him to keep me updated. But something was off. I started realizing I'd made a mistake, one I couldn't undo. It wasn't the kids I was worried about anymore. It was how much I'd left them with my mother, a woman who barely managed to keep herself afloat, let alone 2 kids. Max had become a father figure to Leo, even though he was only 12. Max, the loyal one, would shoulder the burden as best as he could. But Leo's condition, his epilepsy, was nothing to take lightly. He needed constant attention, specific medication at specific times. That wasn't something Max could handle on his own. Yet, there he was, trying to hold it all together while I was miles away, working, pretending like everything was fine. I don't know how it all happened, but one day, I looked up and realized that the man I'd been fighting to become, the one who won the custody battle, had made a mess of things. I wasn't a father. I was a man too busy to care. It hit me when Max sent me the text that shook me to my core. The words were short, but they stung. Dad, I don't think you're coming back. You didn't want us anyway. And I knew then. The truth was already out there, whether I liked it or not. Max's days began to blur together in a haze of worry and exhaustion. When the sun rose, it was the same as the day before, just another cycle of trying to hold everything together. Grandma had slipped into her routine of watching television all day, her frail body glued to the worn-out couch, a lit cigarette dangling from her fingers. The smell of stale smoke hung thick in the air, mixing with the scent of microwave dinners that she somehow always burned. Max had learned to navigate the mess. He could make his way through the cluttered trailer without tripping over beer cans or the piles of scratch-off tickets that Grandma kept scattered across the floor. He did his best to keep things running smoothly, but it wasn't easy. He couldn't remember the last time Grandma had gotten out of her pajamas, let alone thought to give Leo his seizure medication on time. The pills, the ones Leo relied on to stay healthy, had become a distant memory. Max tried. He really did. He would sit on the edge of the couch, hold out the tiny bottle, and plead with Grandma to give Leo his medicine. But more often than not, she'd mutter about how she needed to take care of things, or how it was just too much right now, before drifting back into the fog of her cigarette smoke and reruns of daytime TV. Max had tried to fill in, but it was never enough. He'd tried memorizing the dosages, but they were too complicated. Leo's routine was meticulous. Half a pill here, a full one there. And when he couldn't remember, he'd just give Leo whatever he had, hoping it would be enough. He couldn't fail Leo, not when their father was so far away. But the signs were becoming harder to ignore. Leo started to show little signs of deterioration. At first, it was small things. The slurred words that tripped from his tongue when he tried to speak, the occasional stumble when he walked. Max brushed it off at first. Maybe Leo was just tired from being in a new place. But then it got worse. Leo's balance became shaky. He would clutch onto Max's arm for support, his face pale, his forehead damp with sweat. It was clear something was wrong. At school, Max could feel the growing pressure. Teachers whispered behind their desks, casting him worried glances. He heard the murmurs, the concerned questions about why Leo looked so pale, why his clothes were always wrinkled, why he always looked so sluggish. But Max lied. He told them it was nothing, that Leo was just adjusting to the new environment, that everything was fine. Max could barely focus on his schoolwork anymore. His grades had dropped, but he didn't care. The last thing on his mind was algebra or history tests. He only cared about keeping Leo safe. One afternoon, after a particularly bad episode where Leo had almost collapsed in the middle of the living room, Max found himself searching through the compost bin outside for spoiled fruit. The fridge had little to offer. With Grandma asleep in her chair, her cigarette barely hanging from her lips, Max had no choice but to find whatever he could. His stomach growled as he dug through the rotten produce, the smell of decay curling into the air. He knew it wasn't right, but what else could he do? Just as he found a half-rotten apple, a neighbor, a woman from a few houses down, pulled up in her car. She'd always been a little curious about the boys, and she'd seen Max looking for food in the compost bin before. Today, she didn't ignore him. Instead, she pulled over, rolling down her window. "Max?" she asked, her voice laced with concern. "What are you doing out here?" Max stood frozen for a moment, caught with the apple in his hand. Just looking for something to eat," he mumbled, trying to make it sound normal. She frowned, her eyes scanning the scene behind him. "Max, you should be inside. It's not safe out here. What's going on?" Max knew she wasn't buying it. He tried to offer a smile, but it fell flat. Before he could say anything else, the woman spoke again, her voice low and serious. "I'm calling someone, Max. I can't let this go." Max's heart sank as she pulled away, her car tires crunching the gravel in her driveway. He looked back toward the trailer, to Grandma still in front of the TV, and then back to the apple in his hand. He knew what this meant. He had failed, and soon, someone would find out. But there was nothing he could do to fix it now. It was only a matter of time before everything came crashing down. The knock on the door came while Max was sitting at the kitchen table, trying to make sense of the jumble of numbers from the school forms. Leo was still in bed, the exhaustion from his seizures still weighing heavy on his little body. Max was struggling to keep his focus, his thoughts scattering in every direction. He jumped when he heard the knock again, louder this time, sharp and insistent. "Max, you expecting someone?" Grandma's voice was distant, muffled by the TV blaring in the other room. Max stood slowly, his heart pounding. He wasn't expecting anyone. Not today. He opened the door to find a woman in a smart, pressed outfit standing on the doorstep, holding a folder in her hands. "Hi, I'm Dana, a child welfare officer. I need to speak with you," she said, her tone professional but soft. Something about her eyes made Max freeze. She was serious. There was no warmth in her expression, but there was a quiet urgency that made him want to shut the door and hide. Sure," Max muttered, stepping aside so she could enter. The house felt even smaller with her inside, the air thick with the smell of stale cigarettes and microwave dinners. Dana looked around, her eyes quickly taking in the scattered papers, the clutter, and the sagging furniture. Max could feel the weight of her gaze as she moved through the small living room, her boots clicking sharply against the linoleum floor. "Are you living here alone with your brother?" Dana asked, her voice steady, but there was an edge to it now, like she could already tell something wasn't right. "No, Grandma's here," Max said quickly, afraid to reveal too much, afraid of what might happen if she started asking questions about Grandma's behavior. "She's just not feeling well." Dana's brow furrowed slightly, but she didn't push him. Instead, she sat down at the kitchen table, pulling a pen from her bag and flipping open the folder. "I need to ask you some questions about your living situation and your brother. I've been made aware of some concerns, Max." Max swallowed hard, his palms sweaty. He had no idea how she knew. Maybe the neighbor had called. He couldn't risk being caught in a lie. If she found out that he was trying to cover for Grandma, that he was barely keeping it together, he wasn't sure what would happen. His father would never forgive him. "I'm doing fine," Max said quickly, looking over his shoulder at Leo's bedroom door. He couldn't hear his brother stirring, but it was always hard to tell. "Everything's fine. We're just adjusting." Dana didn't seem convinced. She glanced around the room again, her eyes lingering on the empty pill bottles by the sink, the half-finished snack on the table, and the thin, pale light spilling in through the windows. "Max, I need you to be honest with me. Are you getting the help you need here? Is your grandmother able to care for you and your brother properly?" Max felt a flush of panic rise in his chest. He wanted to scream, to tell her everything, to explain just how much he was doing to keep it together, but the words caught in his throat. The last thing he wanted was to have his father called back from the fire, back from his deployment, to deal with this mess. His dad didn't care. Not really. Not unless it made him look good. "I'm fine," Max repeated, the lie tasting bitter in his mouth. He looked down at his hands. "Grandma's just tired sometimes, but she's fine. We're fine." Dana didn't respond immediately, and Max could feel the silence stretch on between them, a thick, uncomfortable pause that seemed to grow longer with every second. He waited for her to say something, to accuse him, to say she was calling someone. But instead, she simply pulled out her phone and began typing. Max could feel his heartbeat thudding in his chest. "I'm going to have to contact your father," Dana said after a moment, her voice low but firm. "I need to speak with him." Max's stomach dropped. "Please don't," he said, his voice almost pleading. He's really busy. He's out of state, working. I'll take care of it. Everything's fine here." Dana paused and looked at him with a hint of skepticism. "Max, I'm sure you're doing your best, but I'm not leaving here without speaking to your father. This is about your safety." Just as Max opened his mouth to argue, the doorbell rang. The sharp, jarring sound made him jump. He wasn't expecting anyone else. He glanced nervously at Dana, but she gave him no time to think. She stood up, eyes fixed on the door, then turned back to him. "This may be him," she said, moving toward the door. Max's stomach twisted. He had hoped his dad would stay out of it. But here he was, mid-deployment, in full uniform, a hero back in front of his sons. He had clearly flown in just to play the part of the devoted father. When the door swung open, there he was, his father, dressed in his fireman's suit, looking as polished and strong as ever. Max's breath caught in his throat as he watched the man walk through the door like he was about to step into a press conference. This was his dad, back to defend himself, back to make everything look perfect. He would play the part. He would make sure no one saw the truth. Max felt a rush of anger, helplessness, and disappointment flood over him. "Hello, officer." His father greeted Dana with a firm handshake, his voice smooth and confident. "I'm Noah Miller. I'm sorry to hear there's been an issue, but I assure you, everything is fine here. My boys are taken care of." Dana's gaze flicked to Max, then back to his father, who stood tall, looking like the hero he always pretended to be. Max's heart raced. This was the same man who couldn't even be bothered to check on them after dumping them at Grandma's house. "I'm sure everything's fine, sir," Dana said, her tone polite but guarded. "But I have to take a closer look at the situation." Noah smiled, his hand placed firmly on Max's shoulder, and for the first time in a long while, Max hated the touch. "You know, I'm a firefighter. I've been working my whole life to make sure people are safe," Noah said, his voice booming. "This is just a misunderstanding. The neighbors, they don't get it. They're probably just upset about my career. They're making this into something it's not." Max's stomach churned. His dad was doing what he always did, turning everything into a show. He was trying to be the hero. Again, Dana hesitated, then pulled out her phone. "I'll have to report this, sir. We'll need to follow through." Noah's smile never faltered. "I understand," he said, the words dripping with charm. "But my family's under attack here, and I won't stand for it. These people," he waved toward the door, "they want to tear us apart because of my service. I'm just doing what I have to do to protect my boys." Max looked down at his shoes. He could feel the tension building in the air, like the calm before a storm. Dana hesitated, then nodded slowly, clearly uncomfortable but unwilling to push further. "All right then, I'll hold off on further action for now, but I'll be back to follow up," Dana said, collecting her things and heading for the door. Max stood frozen in the living room, caught between his father's smile and the truth he knew was buried deep beneath the surface. As Dana left, his father turned to him, and for a brief moment, Max saw the faintest flicker of pride in his eyes. But then it was gone, and Max was left with the nagging feeling that things were about to get a lot worse. The weeks that followed were a blur of tension, the kind that hangs in the air like smoke after a fire, impossible to escape. Leo's health had been spiraling downwards, his seizures becoming more frequent, and Max was left with no way to stop it. There were days when Max would wake up, already exhausted, only to find Leo's medicine missing, his seizures just waiting to happen. And there were other days when he couldn't even remember if he'd given Leo his pills at all. But it was the night everything fell apart that still haunts Max the most. Max had been trying to wake Grandma up for over an hour. She'd passed out in her chair, a cigarette burning in the ashtray next to her, the television blaring some game show she didn't even seem to watch. Leo, exhausted and pale, was lying on the couch next to her, his small body curled in a way that didn't look natural. He hadn't eaten in days, and it was getting harder to get him to take his meds, but Max couldn't afford to skip a dose. "Not now, Grandma," Max said, his voice shaking. Leo needs his meds." She didn't stir. Max's heart thudded in his chest. He tried shaking her harder, but still, no response. His mind raced, fear clawing at his throat, but it was the sound of Leo coughing that snapped him out of his panic. Leo's breath had become shallow, his lips turning blue. Max's stomach twisted as he rushed over to him, shaking him, trying to rouse him, but it was clear, Leo wasn't waking up. "Leo, come on, wake up." Max's voice cracked. There was no time left. He fumbled for his phone, hands trembling, dialing 911 as his brother's breathing became more erratic. "Please, please, please," he muttered under his breath. The dispatcher answered almost immediately, her calm voice a stark contrast to the chaos flooding Max's mind. He barely heard her words as he relayed what was happening, but something about her tone, something in the way she kept him talking as she assured him help was on the way, calmed him just enough to keep moving. Max stayed with Leo, clutching his hand, trying to keep him still, trying to make sure he didn't slip away. His brother's tiny body spasmed again, and Max's breath hitched as the paramedics finally burst through the door. When they took Leo away on the stretcher, Max's world felt like it was spinning out of control. His heart was still pounding in his chest, a steady drumbeat of terror. He followed them to the hospital, sitting in the cold waiting room, hands folded tightly in his lap, unable to move, unable to think. They told him Leo was critical, that they would need to run tests to assess the damage. Max barely heard them as they spoke, too consumed with guilt to focus on anything else. He had failed. He had promised Leo that he would be there for him, and now his little brother was fighting for his life, alone in a sterile hospital room. It wasn't until later that night, when the doctors finally pulled him aside, that Max understood the full extent of what had happened. They told him that Leo's brain had been severely damaged from the seizures, brain trauma caused by missed medication and malnutrition. Max felt the weight of the words, crushing him, a sickening wave of realization washing over him. He hadn't known. He hadn't known what to do. That's when Ms. Devlin arrived, a child welfare officer who had clearly seen it all before. Her serious eyes scanned Max for a moment, taking in his wide, scared gaze. She didn't say anything immediately, but took a seat next to him, her hands folded on the table. "Max," she said gently, her voice a little softer than he expected. "I need you to understand something. Your brother might not survive this, but I need to know who's been taking care of him." Max swallowed hard, his throat tight with emotion. I tried," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I try to do everything, but Grandma, she's always too drunk or asleep. I couldn't do it alone." Ms. Devlin's face softened, but only slightly. She had a job to do, and Max could see that she was about to take action. "I'm going to file an emergency custody order," she said. "You and your brother can't stay here. I'm bypassing local CPS, and we'll get you both into a safe place." Max's stomach twisted. He couldn't think straight. What would happen to Grandma? What would happen to him? To Leo? How could he do this to them? He didn't know what to say, how to process the reality of it. But before he could speak, a voice broke through the haze, his father's voice, booming and commanding. "I'm here." Noah Miller stormed into the room, his flight suit still on, his face set in an expression of barely contained fury. Max's stomach churned at the sight of him. He had just flown back, mid-deployment, to regain control of the narrative, to control everything. "You don't know what you're doing." Noah snapped at Ms. Devlin, his voice cold and sharp. "My boys are fine. They just—" He broke off, his eyes flicking to Max, trying to play the hero again. "They just need a little discipline. This is an attack on me, on my family. People are just jealous of what we have." Ms. Devlin didn't back down. She was used to men like this, used to their bluster and their egos. "I've seen enough," she said, her voice firm. "Your son is in critical condition because of neglect, and I'm not leaving here without taking action. If you want to fight this, we'll do it in court." Noah's face twisted, his fists clenched at his sides. "You're making a mistake," he hissed, glaring at her. "You'll regret this." Max could see the anger bubbling up in his father's eyes, but something inside him had shifted. For the first time in his life, he didn't want to protect Noah. Not from this. Not when Leo was lying unconscious in a hospital bed. Not when he'd already been abandoned. And as Ms. Devlin's words sank in, Max realized the one thing he'd been too afraid to admit. The only thing that mattered now was Leo. The sterile smell of the hospital made Max's stomach churn. He hadn't slept since Leo was rushed in, and his mind was spinning. The doctor had told him that Leo was stable now, but the words didn't feel real. How could things get better when he had failed so badly? Max sat in the cold waiting area, eyes darting around the room. He couldn't stop thinking about the mess they'd both been left in, how everything had crumbled so fast, how his dad hadn't been there when it mattered. The door to the room opened, and Dr. Noor stepped in, her expression unreadable. Behind her was Ms. Devlin, the child welfare officer. Max immediately tensed. He had hoped the worst was over, that they would leave him and Leo alone. But it was clear that things were just beginning to unravel. "Max," Dr. Noor said, her voice steady but serious. "We've done everything we can for Leo, but I want you to understand the gravity of the situation. He's lucky to be alive. The prolonged neglect, missing medication, malnutrition, has left lasting damage." Max's breath caught in his throat. The word neglect hit harder than any physical blow. It was his fault. He had failed Leo, and now the whole world knew. "His brain is struggling to recover," Dr. Noor continued, "and the damage is significant. I'm afraid the road ahead might be long." Max's mind raced. He wanted to ask if Leo would be okay, but the words felt useless. Would it matter? Leo was alive, but how much of his health had been taken from him? The guilt was suffocating. Ms. Devlin stepped forward. "Max, I'm going to need to speak to you about Leo's future. We'll be filing emergency custody paperwork, effective immediately." Max felt a cold chill crawl up his spine. He knew this moment was coming, but now that it was here, he couldn't speak. He just nodded, trying to hold it together as everything he knew about his life was slipping away. But then he heard a familiar voice, sharp and confident. Max turned to see his father standing at the door, storming in with his usual presence, wearing his flight suit. as if he'd just stepped off a heroic mission. "Now, hold on a second," Noah said, his voice a booming contrast to the quiet tension. "What's all this? Why is my son under investigation?" Max's stomach flipped. He had known this moment was coming, but nothing could prepare him for seeing his father again, especially not like this. Noah looked like the perfect hero, with his uniform and strong posture, as if nothing was wrong. Ms. Devlin didn't hesitate. "I'm afraid your son is a victim of neglect," she said flatly. "Leo's condition was caused by missed medication, malnutrition, and lack of proper care. We'll be taking immediate action to ensure his safety." Noah's face hardened. "This is ridiculous," he said, shaking his head. "You can't be serious. I'm out there fighting wildfires, risking my life for this country, and now I come home to find you're accusing me of neglecting my own kid?" Max could feel the anger radiating off his father, and a part of him wanted to retreat into the corner, away from the confrontation. But he couldn't. "Not this time. This isn't about you, Dad," Max said quietly, his voice shaking. "This is about Leo. About everything I've been trying to do to keep him safe." Noah cut him off. "You don't understand. This is about my career, my reputation. You think this is some kind of game?" His voice dropped, growing cold and threatening. "You better not be throwing my name around like this, Max. You know what's at stake. I've worked too damn hard for this, and I'm not letting anyone, especially you, mess it all up." Max's heart skipped. He had heard his father's threats before, but this time, it didn't have the same weight. Max didn't care about his father's reputation anymore. Not when Leo's life hung in the balance. "I'm not doing this anymore, Dad," Max said, his voice growing stronger. "I'm not going to protect you anymore. Leo almost died because of this. Because Grandma wasn't fit to take care of us, and you didn't even care. You weren't even here." Noah took a step forward, eyes blazing. "You think I don't care about you, or Leo?" His voice was low now, full of venom. "You think you're the only one who's trying to keep this family together? You have no idea what I've been through to get us where we are. I'm not going to let anyone tear it down, not even you." Max felt his breath catch. For the first time, he realized how little his father cared about him, about them. Everything had been about appearances, about what would make Noah look like the hero. "Everything you've done," Max whispered, "it's all for you, not for us." Noah's jaw clenched, but he didn't say anything. He just glared at Max, as if sizing him up, as if deciding what to do next. "Max," Ms. Devlin said, her voice cutting through the tension, "I'm going to need you to come with me now. I'm filing the emergency paperwork. You'll be placed in a foster home while we sort this out." Max didn't argue. He couldn't. It was the first time he had felt a spark of hope in weeks, like someone was finally doing something to help Leo. He followed Ms. Devlin out of the room, the weight of his father's stare still burning into his back. As they walked down the hospital corridor, Max's heart was heavy, but he couldn't look back. Not this time. The media storm started small, just a local news blip, a few lines about a firefighter hero and his two sons, torn apart by child services. But as Noah worked his connections, the story grew. It became a public spectacle. Hero dad torn from sons splashed across headlines, his flight suit gleaming in every photograph, a symbol of strength and sacrifice. Max saw the clips on TV, heard the stories on the radio, and read the comments online. The more the media rallied behind his father, the more the world seemed to forget what had really happened. Max sat in the corner of the foster home, his arms crossed tightly against his chest. His new family, well, his temporary family, tried to make him feel at ease, but he couldn't shake the feeling of being under siege. Every time he went outside, he saw people whispering, casting glances in his direction. At school, kids looked at him like he was a villain. They called him a liar, ungrateful. They all seemed to believe the narrative his father had so carefully crafted. Max was just a kid trying to tear his father down. The calls came in, too. The foster parents started receiving threatening messages, anonymous phone calls warning them to keep that kid in line, or they'd regret it. At first, they tried to brush it off, but the tension in the house grew thicker. Max could feel it. Even his foster mom, who was usually kind and patient, started looking at him differently, like she wasn't sure if he could be trusted. He could almost hear the doubt in her voice when she asked him about what had happened at Grandma's house. Max didn't blame her. He knew how easy it was for people to believe Noah. He had the uniform, the reputation, the charm, and he knew exactly how to use it. But Max knew the truth, even if the world didn't. His father was using everything, his service, his uniform, his status, to paint himself as the hero in a story that wasn't his. He wasn't a hero. He was a man who had abandoned his sons to a woman who couldn't even remember their names. Max tried to ignore the noise, to block out the pressure that seemed to hang over everything. But it was impossible. The outside world was just too loud. Every day, the media ran puff pieces. Every day, his father smiled in front of the camera and talked about how this was just a misunderstanding, how the system was out to get him. There was no room for the truth in all of that. Meanwhile, Leo remained in the hospital, his condition still critical. The doctors told Max they were hopeful, but no one could say for sure how long it would take for Leo to recover. He felt the weight of every passing day, knowing that his brother was fighting for his life, and the world was too distracted by his father's fabricated hero story to see it. At school, things were no better. Max barely managed to focus on his classes. His teachers, who had once been concerned, now looked at him with uncertainty. The whispers were constant. Kids he had barely spoken to before began to pull away, and he overheard them mocking him behind his back. Did you hear? His dad's some big hero, but he's just a little brat who doesn't appreciate anything. Max wanted to scream. He wanted to throw it all in their faces, but he couldn't. His father's voice rang in his ears. You don't want to make trouble. Keep quiet. Protect the family name. He could still hear that, too. The way his father would get angry whenever anyone spoke out of turn, whenever anyone threatened the perfect image he'd so carefully built. Ms. Devlin, the social worker, remained his only ally, but even she was under pressure. As much as she wanted to help, she had her own battles to fight, and Max could see it in her eyes. She had to balance the growing public outcry with the truth that seemed to keep slipping through the cracks. Max tried his best to keep quiet, to pretend like he could survive the storm. But the cracks were starting to show. He felt the pressure building. He wanted to ask Ms. Devlin if there was a way to make it stop, if there was a way to make people believe him, but he couldn't. The world was against him. His father was too powerful, too persuasive. That night, after another round of messages from the media, and yet another phone call from an angry neighbor, Max sat down with his journal. He'd started keeping it again, jotting down his thoughts, his anger, his confusion. It was the only place where he could let go of all the fear and frustration that built up inside him. He wrote about Leo, about the endless hours he spent watching over his brother in that damn trailer. He wrote about Grandma, and how, despite everything, he had tried to make it work. He wrote about his father, and the lies that had twisted their lives into something unrecognizable. And he wrote about the moment when he realized that his father was never going to be the man he wanted him to be, the man he needed him to be. Max closed the journal, wiped his eyes, and stood up. He wasn't sure how much longer he could keep going like this. The world might believe his father, but Max knew the truth, and the truth was all he had left. The courtroom felt like an arena, and Max was the unwilling gladiator. He sat on the witness stand, his hands tightly gripping the edge of the podium, his mind racing. The courtroom was filled with murmurs as people filed in, all eyes on him, the boy who had been through so much. His father stood just across the room, dressed in his military uniform, surrounded by supporters, his firefighter colleagues, a retired fire chief, and other former supervisors, all there to vouch for his integrity, to paint him as the hero he claimed to be. Max tried to stay calm, but he could feel the weight of everyone's expectations pressing down on him. The audience was here for a show, and he was expected to deliver. His father's lawyer, a smooth-talking man with a practiced smile, had already made his argument, claiming that Max had been exaggerating, that the neglect of Leo was just a series of unfortunate coincidences, and that the grandmother had simply been overwhelmed. Max had heard the same things before, when his dad would defend his actions, spin his lies, make everything look perfect. But this time, Max wasn't buying it. Ms. Devlin had prepared him for this moment, but nothing could prepare him for the pressure of sitting there, with everyone watching, knowing that his words would determine the fate of his family. The truth was his only ally, but would anyone believe him? Max cleared his throat as his name was called. The questions came fast, too fast. His father's lawyer was like a lion, circling, looking for any slip, any crack that might let him tear Max apart. Max, can you explain the circumstances surrounding your living situation? The lawyer asked, his voice smooth and controlled. Your grandmother's care for you and your brother? Wasn't it true that you just didn't adjust to the new environment? Max's pulse quickened. He swallowed hard, trying to keep the tremble out of his voice. He had to say the truth, but the truth felt like it would rip everything apart. We tried, Max said, his voice shaking slightly. But Grandma wasn't. She wasn't really there. She would sleep all the time. And when Leo needed his medicine, she'd forget. I tried, but I couldn't do it all on my own. The room grew silent. Max looked at the judge, but the judge was hard to read, his face stern and impassive. The lawyer's eyes flicked back and forth, clearly looking for a crack in Max's testimony. Your father, Noah Miller, has always been an upstanding citizen, hasn't he? The lawyer pressed. A decorated firefighter, someone who dedicates his life to service. Surely, you would agree that he's someone who would want the best for his children, someone who could never neglect his own sons, right? Max could feel his heart pounding in his chest. The words rang in his ears. Someone who could never neglect his own sons. That's what they all thought. That's what the world believed. But the truth was different. It had always been different. And Max knew that if he didn't speak now, the lie would win. His father's perfect story would become everyone's truth. Max looked up at the judge, then at his father, standing tall in his uniform, his face stern with that familiar look of defiance. Max's voice caught in his throat, but he forced the words out. No, he said quietly. He didn't want us. He just wanted to look good. It wasn't about us. It was about him. The courtroom went deathly silent. The murmurs began to rise, and Max could see the shock in the eyes of some of the spectators, some of them visibly shifting uncomfortably in their seats. He felt exposed, vulnerable, but the weight on his chest lifted just a little. His father's lawyer stepped forward, pushing back against Max's testimony. "Isn't it true, Max, that you just want attention? That you're making these accusations to manipulate the system, to punish your father?" Max wanted to scream. He wanted to shout that no one understood, but he didn't. He stayed calm, his mind focused on Leo, on the truth. "I'm not lying," Max said, his voice barely a whisper. "I'm telling you the truth. He wasn't there. He didn't care." Noah Miller stood in the back of the courtroom, his fists clenched, his jaw was tight, and his eyes locked on Max with an intensity that made Max's stomach twist. He had seen that look before, the look of a man who would do anything to protect his own image, even at the cost of his children. Max couldn't take his eyes off his father. It was hard to look at him now, to see him in that uniform, to see him stand there as if he was the victim, as if the world owed him something. But Max knew better now. He wasn't going to let his father control him anymore. He wasn't going to let him lie to everyone. Not again. Ms. Devlin stepped in, her voice steady. "Max's testimony is consistent with our findings," she said firmly. "The boys have been subjected to neglect, both physical and emotional. Leo's medical records show repeated failures in medication management. The situation at their grandmother's home was not only unsafe, it was life-threatening." The defense lawyer opened his mouth to counter, but the judge raised a hand, signaling him to be quiet. "I've heard enough," the judge said, his voice cutting through the tension. He looked at both sides, his gaze heavy, considering. "We will take a brief recess before proceeding with the next steps." Max stood there, trying to breathe through the pressure, his mind still racing. He didn't know what was going to happen next. His heart ached for Leo. He just wanted his brother to be okay. But he had done what he needed to do. The truth was out. And no matter what happened now, he had taken the first step toward finding peace. Max sat rigid in the courtroom, the weight of the moment pressing down on him like a ton of bricks. It had been a long, grueling process, with his father's smothering presence constantly looming over every decision. But now, the final decision was close. The judge was flipping through papers, eyes scanning the evidence, and Max couldn't help but wonder which way the scales would tip. His father stood near the back, shoulders squared, jaw tight. The same posture he'd worn throughout the entire battle, stoic, unyielding. He was a man who had always used his uniform and his career to silence his critics, to make the world believe he was above reproach. And now, in front of the judge, he was doing it again. Max felt a sickening sense of déjà vu. He'd been fighting this battle alone, even though his father's claims painted a different picture. The public had rallied behind Noah, Max's father, the hero firefighter, the man who could do no wrong. But Max knew the truth. He knew what he'd seen, what he'd lived through. Finally, the judge spoke, his voice calm but filled with authority. "After reviewing the evidence and hearing from both sides, I have come to a conclusion," the judge said, his eyes flicking between the defense and the prosecution, and finally resting on Max. Max felt the sting of it, the weight of being the one to stand alone, the one who had been forced to carry the truth. "I recognize the commendable service that Mr. Miller has provided to this country, but the welfare of his children has been put at risk. His judgment, in this case, has endangered his children, and as a result, custody will be denied." The words hit Max like a physical blow. He hadn't expected this. He had half prepared himself for the worst, for the idea that everything he'd done would be for nothing. But hearing the words, "custody denied," brought a wave of relief, one he wasn't sure he deserved. Noah's reaction, however, was immediate, his face contorted with rage. He shot to his feet, fists clenched at his sides. His voice, loud and filled with venom, reverberated through the courtroom. "This is a betrayal," he shouted, his face reddening with fury. "You people are just going to take my sons from me? I fought for this family. I sacrificed everything for them, and you turn your back on me. You think I'm the bad guy? This whole thing is a biased system, targeting me because of my career, my service." Max flinched. The words weren't new. He'd heard them before, each time his father had been called to account for his neglect. Max could see it now. The anger wasn't about Leo's health or Max's well-being. It was about losing control, about his reputation being threatened. It was always about him. The judge's voice cut through the outburst, firm and commanding. "Mr. Miller, I will not tolerate these outbursts. You've been given every opportunity to present your case, and you've had your day in court. This decision is final." Noah's hands shook as he tried to control his anger. He glanced at Max, and for a moment, their eyes locked. Max could see the threat in his father's gaze, the same one he'd seen before, the one that said, "I'm not done with you." But Max didn't back down. He didn't flinch. He had already taken the most important step. He had spoken the truth. "I'm sorry, Your Honor," Noah said, his voice low, his composure slowly returning. "But this isn't over. You'll regret this." With that, Noah stormed out of the courtroom, leaving a wake of tension in his trail. Max's body felt like it had turned to stone, the adrenaline fading, leaving him numb. Ms. Devlin placed a hand on his shoulder, her voice a soft whisper. "You did the right thing, Max. You protected Leo. You protected your brother." Max nodded, but the words didn't feel real. The courtroom was silent except for the shuffle of papers and the low murmur of the audience. His heart still pounded in his chest, the weight of the battle not quite lifted. As he left the courtroom with Ms. Devlin, he caught a glimpse of the world outside, a world that would now see him differently, now that he had taken a stand. The media would run with the story of the hero dad who'd been wronged, and the whispers would continue. But none of that mattered now. Max had done what he needed to do, and Leo, his brother, was safe. Max sat in the quiet room of the foster home, the walls still unfamiliar, the silence almost overwhelming. His fingers toyed nervously with the edge of his notebook, the pen resting beside him. Therapy was something he wasn't sure he needed at first, but now, sitting in a chair that didn't belong to him, in a home that felt like a temporary stop, he realized just how much he needed to process. The past few months felt like a blur. The courtroom, his father's fiery outbursts, the constant public campaign to tarnish his name, it all seemed distant now, like a storm he had survived, but one that had left its mark. Max's mind still replayed the constant noise of his father's accusations, the way the world had swung to his side, and the ugly whispers that followed him and Leo everywhere they went. Max had seen the news after the verdict. His father's face, still wearing his fire suit, smiling for the cameras, twisting the truth. The media had run with it. Hero dad, torn from sons. The public was swept up in the narrative of the firefighter persecuted by a biased system. The outpouring of support for Noah Miller felt endless. Every article, every post on social media painted Max as the villain, making him question his own sanity. But with each new puff piece, he held on to one thing, the truth, and that was the only thing that mattered now. It had been a week since the judge's ruling, and Leo had slowly started recovering in their new home. The foster parents, a warm couple experienced with complex medical needs, had ensured Leo was getting the care he needed. For the first time in what felt like forever, Max felt like he could breathe without a weight on his chest. The constant worry about Leo's health, about their father's control, was finally behind them. Max could focus on the things that mattered. He glanced over at Leo, sitting at the kitchen table with his art supplies spread out in front of him. Leo had started drawing again, his concentration deep, his face soft with the calm that Max hadn't seen in months. Leo was still thin, his recovery slow, but the spark in his eyes, the one Max hadn't realized had dimmed, was returning. He was getting stronger every day. "How's your drawing going?" Max asked, his voice quiet, careful not to break the peace of the moment. "Good," Leo said, not looking up from his paper. "I'm drawing the nurse who helped me in the hospital. She was nice." Max smiled. It was a small thing, but it was big to Leo. The nurse had made a huge impact on him during his coma, and hearing Leo talk about it made Max feel like maybe, just maybe, things could be okay. In therapy, Max had started writing down everything. He hadn't meant to, but he found that putting the feelings into words, about Leo, about their father, about everything he had been through, helped. He wrote about the fear of losing Leo, about his own growing anger, and the terrible realization that his father had never cared enough to help. He wrote about the moment he had broken, about finally speaking up. It felt good to write, to put it down on paper and leave it behind, at least for a little while. He began to dream, too, not of the past, but of the future. The idea of working in emergency medicine had always lingered in the back of his mind, but now it was something he thought about seriously. Helping people, making a difference, he wanted that. He had seen firsthand what it meant to save someone, to be the person others relied on when it mattered most. The media storm around his father had faded as more evidence of neglect surfaced. His father's supporters had quickly begun to dwindle, distancing themselves from him once the truth came out. Even Noah's colleagues from the fire department started to speak up, realizing the full extent of the manipulation. Max hadn't been expecting it. He had braced himself for the fight to continue, for his father to drag this on forever. But now, with fewer people to defend him, Noah's voice grew quieter. Max had no illusions that his father would ever fully admit to what happened, but with each passing day, the weight of Noah's campaign seemed to lift. Leo had his first day at school a few days ago. It had been hard for him to walk into the building after everything that had happened, but he had a new goal in mind now. He wanted to become a nurse, like the one who had helped him when he was so sick, when he was so close to losing it all. "I want to help people, too," Leo had told Max that night, his voice full of quiet determination. Max nodded, the feeling of pride swelling in his chest. They were both healing, in their own ways. They were rebuilding something new, something safe, something just for them. The foster family, kind and patient, had given them the time and space they needed to find themselves again. They weren't perfect, but they cared, and for now, that was enough. There was no more pressure to pretend, no more pretending for anyone else's sake. Max could see the road ahead now, quiet, safe, and unremarkable, as Leo had said. That was all they needed, and Max knew that no matter what his father would say or do next, they would be okay. They were finally free.